The morning light filtered through the towering glass windows of Blackwood Industries, casting long shadows across the marble floors of the grand lobby. It was in this cathedral of commerce, where ambition and wealth converged like streams into a mighty river, that Eleanor Hartwell found herself standing behind the mahogany reception desk, her fingers trembling slightly as they adjusted the nameplate that bore her title in elegant script, Reception. 3 weeks had passed since she had first crossed the threshold of this imposing edifice. 3 weeks since she had fled the suffocating confines of her previous employment at a small accounting firm where her supervisor's wandering hands and leering comments had made each day a torment to be endured. The memory still sent shivers down her spine. Not of cold, but of that peculiar mixture of fear and indignation that had finally compelled her to tender her resignation with nothing more than her dignity intact and a meager savings account to sustain her through the uncertain days that followed. Eleanor was not a creature of grand aspirations or bold declarations. At 26, she possessed that quiet, understated beauty that society often overlooks in its pursuit of the flashy and immediate. Her auburn hair was always pulled back in a neat chignon, revealing a face marked by intelligent hazel eyes that seemed to hold depths of feeling she dared not express. Her wardrobe consisted of modest blouses and tailored skirts in muted tones, greys, soft blues, and the occasional cream-colored cardigan that had belonged to her mother. She had learned through years of painful experience that to draw attention was to invite scrutiny. And scrutiny had rarely brought her anything but discomfort. The salary at Blackwood Industries was generous, more generous than anything she had dared hope for when she had timidly submitted her application through the online portal, expecting nothing more than the usual automated rejection. When the call had come, delivered in the crisp, professional tones of Mrs. Margaret Thornfield, the head of human resources, Eleanor had been so stunned that she had nearly dropped the telephone. The interview had been a blur of nervous responses and sweaty palms, but somehow, perhaps through divine intervention or simple desperation on their part due to a sudden vacancy, she had been offered the position. Now, as she arranged the fresh orchids that were delivered each Monday morning to grace the reception desk, Eleanor reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. The lobby of Blackwood Industries was a testament to understated luxury, all clean lines and expensive materials, where the very air seemed to whisper of power and influence. Executives in tailored suits strode purposefully across the polished floors, their conversations conducted in the measured tones of those accustomed to being obeyed. Eleanor watched them from her station with a mixture of fascination and trepidation. These titans of industry who moved through her world like ships passing in the night. Her duties were simple enough: greeting visitors, managing appointments, answering the telephone with the prescribed formula that Mrs. Thornfield had made her practice until the words flowed as naturally as breathing. "Good morning, Blackwood Industries. Eleanor speaking. How may I assist you today?" She had developed a system for managing the constant stream of deliveries, meetings, and telephone calls that comprised the lifeblood of the corporation, color-coding her calendar and maintaining detailed logs that would have impressed her former professors at the business college she had attended with such hopes and dreams. Yet for all the efficiency she had cultivated, Eleanor remained what she had always been, a creature more comfortable in the shadows than in the light. When visitors arrived, she greeted them with polite professionalism, but her eyes rarely met theirs for more than the briefest of moments. When the telephone rang, she answered with practiced courtesy, but her voice never rose above the modulated tones that had become second nature to her. She was, in every sense, the perfect receptionist, competent, unobtrusive, and utterly forgettable. It was perhaps this very invisibility that had allowed her to observe, with growing fascination, the intricate social dynamics that played out daily in the lobby. She'd learned to recognize the subtle hierarchies that governed the interactions between the various executives and their assistants. She could distinguish between those who wielded genuine power and those who merely aspired to it by the way they carried themselves, the deference they received, and the subtle changes in atmosphere that accompanied their presence. But of all the figures who populated her daily observations, none commanded more attention than the man who remained largely a mystery to her. Adrian Blackwood himself, the chief executive officer and heir to the empire that bore his family name. Eleanor had caught only glimpses of him during her tenure, a tall figure moving purposefully toward the executive elevators, surrounded by an entourage of assistants and advisors. He was younger than she had expected for someone in his position, perhaps in his mid-30s. With dark hair and a bearing that spoke of absolute confidence in his own authority. The stories about Adrian Blackwood circulated through the building like whispered legends. Some spoke of his meteoric rise to power following his father's retirement, others of his reputation for brilliance in business matters that had elevated the company to unprecedented heights. There were darker rumors, too, of a man who demanded perfection from those around him, who had little patience for incompetence and whose displeasure could end careers with surgical precision. Eleanor had learned to recognize the signs of his impending arrival, the sudden straightening of spines among the executive assistants, the hasty adjustments to ties and jackets, the way conversations grew more subdued as if the very air had grown thinner. She had never spoken to him directly, of course. Their worlds moved in entirely different orbits, separated by layers of hierarchy that might as well have been chasms. When he passed through the lobby, which was rarely, Eleanor's gaze would inevitably find its way to her computer screen or the papers on her desk, anything to avoid the possibility of that awkward moment when their eyes might meet and she would be required to offer some acknowledgement of his presence. It was a Tuesday morning in late November when the first disruption to Eleanor's carefully ordered world occurred. She had arrived at her usual time, 7:30 sharp, to find the lobby already bustling with activity. A conference was scheduled for later that morning, something to do with international markets and expansion opportunities, and the air fairly hummed with the tension that always accompanied such high-stakes gatherings. Eleanor had just finished updating the visitor log when she noticed him, a gentleman of perhaps 55 years, distinguished in appearance with silver-grey hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He stood near the information kiosk, consulting what appeared to be a smartphone, his brow furrowed in concentration. There was something about his posture, the way he held himself slightly apart from the stream of people flowing around him, that struck her as different. When he approached her desk, Eleanor automatically prepared to deliver her standard greeting, but something in his expression, a mixture of hopefulness and uncertainty, gave her pause. He was well-dressed, clearly someone of importance given his presence at Blackwood Industries. But there was a vulnerability in his manner that touched something deep within her typically reserved heart. "Good morning," she began, her voice taking on its professional cadence. "How may I assist you today?" The gentleman smiled, a warm, grateful expression that seemed to light up his entire face. But instead of responding vocally, his hands began to move in a series of fluid, purposeful gestures. Eleanor felt her heart skip as recognition dawned. He was communicating in sign language. For a moment, the busy lobby seemed to fade into the background as Eleanor found herself transported back to her childhood, to the small apartment she had shared with her mother after her father's death. Her mother, Sarah Hartwell, had been born deaf, and sign language had been Eleanor's first language, learned at her mother's knee long before she had mastered the spoken word that the rest of the world took for granted. The years since her mother's death had been marked by a gradual disconnection from the deaf community that had been such an integral part of her early life. The demands of college, then employment, and her own natural inclination towards solitude had led her to exist primarily in the hearing world, using her signing skills only occasionally when she encountered someone who needed assistance. But now, faced with this gentleman's hopeful expression, she felt those long dormant abilities stirring to life, like flowers awakening after a long winter. Without conscious thought, her hands began to move in response, the familiar patterns and rhythms flowing back to her as naturally as breathing. "Good morning," she signed, her fingers forming the words with a grace and fluency that seemed to surprise even her. "My name is Eleanor. How can I help you?" The transformation in the gentleman's face was immediate and profound. Where moments before there had been uncertainty and the particular kind of isolation that comes from being unable to communicate effectively, now there was pure joy, the radiant happiness of someone who had found an unexpected bridge across the chasm of misunderstanding. "Thank you," he signed back, his movements precise and elegant. "My name is David Chen. I have an appointment this morning with Mr. Adrian Blackwood, but I'm afraid I'm quite lost. I've been trying to navigate using my phone, but these modern buildings can be so confusing." Eleanor felt her pulse quicken at the mention of Adrian Blackwood's name, but she pushed aside her nervous reaction to focus on the task at hand. "Of course, Mr. Chen," she signed, allowing a genuine smile to warm her typically reserved expression. "Let me check our appointment system." Her fingers moved quickly across her keyboard, pulling up the morning's schedule. There it was, David Chen, representing Chen International Holdings, scheduled for a 10 o'clock meeting in the executive conference room on the 42nd floor. The notes indicated that Mr. Chen was a potential partner for Blackwood Industries' expansion into the Asian markets. Clearly a meeting of considerable importance. "I have you right here," she signed, turning her screen so he could see the appointment confirmation. "Your meeting with Mr. Blackwood and his international development team at 10 o'clock. The conference room is on the 42nd floor. Would you like me to escort you up, or would you prefer that I arrange for someone from Mr. Blackwood's staff to meet you here?" Mr. Chen's eyes lit up with appreciation. "You're very kind, but I don't want to impose. If you could simply point me toward the correct elevators and perhaps provide me with the floor number, I'm sure I can find my way." Something in his manner, a combination of politeness and underlying nervousness that she recognized all too well from her own daily struggles with anxiety, prompted Eleanor to make an uncharacteristic offer. "Actually, Mr. Chen, I'd be happy to escort you up personally. It would be no trouble at all, and I want to make sure you arrive exactly where you need to be." The gratitude that filled his expression was almost overwhelming in its intensity. "That would be wonderful," he signed. "I must admit, these important meetings always make me a bit anxious, and knowing that I won't get lost is already helping me feel more confident." Eleanor found herself nodding in understanding. "I completely understand that feeling," she replied, her hands moving with increasing fluency as the conversation progressed. "Important meetings can be intimidating even under the best of circumstances." As she prepared to leave her post, Eleanor caught the attention of James Morrison, one of the security guards who had become something of a friend during her weeks at Blackwood Industries. James was a kind-hearted man in his early 40s with a ready smile and a protective instinct toward the younger staff members that reminded Eleanor of the father she had lost so many years ago. "James," she called softly, gesturing for him to approach the desk. "I need to escort a visitor to the 42nd floor for an important meeting. Would you mind keeping an eye on the desk for me? I shouldn't be gone more than 15 minutes. James nodded readily. "Of course, Eleanor. Take your time. I'll handle any calls that come in." Eleanor gathered her access badge and a small notebook where she kept important phone numbers and building information, then turned back to Mr. Chen. "Are you ready?" she signed. "Ready," he confirmed, and together they made their way toward the executive elevator bank. As they walked across the lobby, Eleanor became acutely aware of the curious glances their conversation was drawing from passers-by. The fluid dance of their hands, the animated expressions that were such an integral part of sign language communication, the obvious warmth and understanding flowing between them. It was clear that their interaction was capturing attention in a way that made Eleanor's cheeks warm with self-consciousness. "Have you been working here long?" Mr. Chen asked, as they waited for the elevator. "Just a few weeks," Eleanor replied, grateful for the distraction from her growing awareness of being observed. "I'm still learning my way around, but everyone has been very welcoming." "And you learned sign language?" "My mother was deaf," Eleanor explained, the familiar pang of loss that always accompanied thoughts of her mother, tempered by the warmth of sharing this connection with someone who would understand its significance. "It was my first language, really. I spoke with my hands before I ever spoke with my voice." Mr. Chen nodded with deep understanding. "My daughter is deaf," he shared. "Watching you communicate so naturally with such obvious fluency and compassion, it reminds me why representation matters so much. To see someone like you in a position where you can help others who might otherwise struggle to navigate spaces like this, it gives me hope." The elevator arrived with a soft chime, its brass doors sliding open to reveal the plush interior that Eleanor had only glimpsed during her initial tour of the building. As they stepped inside and she pressed the button for the 42nd floor, Eleanor found herself thinking about Mr. Chen's words. She had never considered her position at Blackwood Industries in terms of representation or helping others who might face communication barriers. To her, it had simply been a job, a means of supporting herself while she tried to rebuild her life after the traumatic experience at her previous workplace. But now, as she watched Mr. Chen's face relax into an expression of genuine comfort and confidence, she began to understand that perhaps her role here might encompass more than she had initially realized. Perhaps her unique skills and experiences could serve a purpose beyond simply greeting visitors and managing appointments. "Tell me about your daughter," she signed, as the elevator climbed smoothly toward their destination. Mr. Chen's face lit up with paternal pride. "Her name is Grace. She's 22, just graduated from university with a degree in graphic design. She's incredibly talented, but like so many young people in the deaf community, she sometimes struggles to find opportunities where her talents are truly valued rather than seen as limitations to be overcome." Eleanor nodded, understanding the deeper implications of his words. "The world is slowly changing," she signed, "but not nearly fast enough." "Exactly," Mr. Chen agreed. "That's why, when I see someone like you, clearly competent and professional, representing a company like Blackwood Industries, it gives me hope that Grace will find her place in a world that truly appreciates what she has to offer." The elevator chimed again as they reached the 42nd floor, its doors opening to reveal a corridor that seemed to exist in an entirely different universe from the lobby Eleanor knew so well. The walls were lined with original artwork. The carpet was thick and luxurious, and the very air seemed to whisper of power and influence. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered breathtaking views of the city skyline, and Eleanor felt momentarily dizzy from both the height and the rarefied atmosphere of the executive level. "This way," she signed, consulting the small building directory she had brought with her. The executive conference room was located at the far end of the corridor, behind imposing double doors of dark wood that seemed to emanate an almost palpable sense of importance. As they walked, Eleanor became increasingly aware of the magnitude of the meeting that Mr. Chen was about to attend. The notes in the appointment system had indicated that this was a potential partnership worth hundreds of millions of dollars, the kind of deal that could reshape both companies' futures. The thought that she, Eleanor Hartwell, was playing even a small role in facilitating such momentous events was both thrilling and terrifying. "Here we are," she signed as they approached the conference room doors. "Would you like me to announce your arrival to Mr. Blackwood's assistant, or would you prefer to handle the introduction yourself?" Mr. Chen paused, his expression thoughtful. "Actually, would you mind staying for just a moment? Sometimes these initial introductions can be challenging when there are communication barriers, and I want to make sure we start off on the right foot." Eleanor felt her heart rate increase at the prospect of potentially interacting with Adrian Blackwood directly, but Mr. Chen's request was both reasonable and touching in its implicit trust in her abilities. "Of course," she replied. "I'll be happy to help with the introduction." She knocked softly on the door, waiting for the muffled "come in" before pushing it open to reveal a conference room that seemed designed to intimidate and impress in equal measure. A massive table of polished mahogany dominated the space, surrounded by leather chairs that probably cost more than Eleanor made in several months. The walls were lined with screens displaying market data and financial projections, and the panoramic windows offered a view of the city that seemed to place the room's occupants above the concerns of ordinary mortals. But it was the man standing at the head of the table, consulting what appeared to be a tablet while speaking in low tones with two other executives, that commanded Eleanor's attention and sent her carefully maintained composure into complete disarray. Adrian Blackwood was younger than she had expected, and far more imposing than the brief glimpses she had caught in the lobby had suggested. He stood perhaps 6 feet tall, with the kind of athletic build that spoke of disciplined attention to physical fitness. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal grey suit clearly custom-tailored to emphasize his broad shoulders and lean frame. But it was his eyes that truly captured her attention. Steel grey and intensely focused, they seemed to take in everything around him with the predatory awareness of someone accustomed to identifying opportunities and threats with equal facility. When he looked up at their entrance, those penetrating eyes fixed first on Eleanor, then shifted to Mr. Chen, and she watched as his expression moved through a series of subtle changes. First came the automatic assessment that seemed to be his default response to any new situation, followed by a brief moment of confusion as he processed the sight of his receptionist escorting a visitor to his private meeting, and finally settling into what Eleanor could only describe as intense curiosity. "Mr. Blackwood," Eleanor began, her voice steady despite the way her heart was hammering against her ribs. "I'd like to introduce Mr. David Chen from Chen International Holdings. He's here for your 10 o'clock appointment." Adrian Blackwood's gaze shifted between Eleanor and Mr. Chen, and she watched as understanding began to dawn in his expression. He had clearly noticed their ongoing signed conversation, and while Eleanor couldn't be certain of his thoughts, there was something in his manner that suggested he was processing far more than she was comfortable with. "Mr. Chen," Adrian said, stepping forward with his hand extended in greeting. "Welcome to Blackwood Industries. I'm Adrian Blackwood, and I'm very pleased to meet you." Mr. Chen smiled warmly and accepted the handshake, but Eleanor could see the slight tension in his posture that indicated he was struggling to follow the conversation. Without thinking, she began to sign Adrian's words for Mr. Chen's benefit. "Thank you for making time to see me today, Mr." Chen signed back, his eyes flicking gratefully to Eleanor as she interpreted his response. "He says thank you for making time to see him today," Eleanor translated, her voice professional but tinged with the nervousness she couldn't quite suppress. Adrian Blackwood's eyes fixed on Eleanor with an intensity that made her feel as though she were being subjected to some sort of examination. But when he spoke, his voice held a warmth that surprised her. "Please tell Mr. Chen that the pleasure is entirely mine," he said, his gaze never leaving Eleanor's face as she translated his words into sign language. "I've been looking forward to our discussion about the potential partnership between our companies." As Eleanor continued to facilitate the introduction, she became increasingly aware of Adrian Blackwood's unwavering attention. While his words were directed to Mr. Chen, his eyes remained fixed on her with a focus that was both flattering and deeply unsettling. She had spent her entire adult life cultivating the art of being invisible, of blending into the background, and avoiding the kind of scrutiny that was now being directed her way with laser-like precision. The other executives in the room, whom Adrian introduced as his Vice President of International Development and his Chief Financial Officer, seemed equally intrigued by the unexpected turn their morning had taken. Eleanor could feel their curious gazes as she continued to interpret the preliminary pleasantries, and she found herself wishing fervently that she could simply disappear into the floor. "I think we're ready to begin our meeting," Adrian finally announced, his eyes still fixed on Eleanor, Miss Hartwell, I want to thank you personally for ensuring that Mr. Chen arrived safely and comfortably. Your assistance has been invaluable." There was something in the way he said the word invaluable that sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine, though whether it was from apprehension or something else entirely, she couldn't quite determine. "It was my pleasure, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, executing a slight bow that she hoped conveyed appropriate respect while signaling her readiness to withdraw from the scene. But as she turned to leave, Adrian's voice stopped her at the door. "Miss Hartwell," he called, his tone carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "I'd like to see you in my office after this meeting concludes. Would 2 o'clock this afternoon be convenient for you?" Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as every eye in the room turned toward her. Of course, Mr. Blackwood," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. 2 o'clock will be fine." "Excellent," he replied, and there was something in his smile that made Eleanor's knees feel decidedly unsteady. "I'll have my assistant confirm the appointment with you." As Eleanor made her way back to the elevator, her mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Had she somehow overstepped her bounds by interpreting for Mr. Chen? Was Adrian Blackwood displeased with her presumption in escorting a visitor to his private meeting? Had she committed some breach of protocol that would cost her the job she so desperately needed? The elevator ride back to the lobby seemed to last an eternity, and when the doors finally opened to reveal the familiar bustle of the reception area, Eleanor felt like a condemned prisoner returning to her cell to await execution. James Morrison looked up from the reception desk with a welcoming smile that faded as he took in her expression. "Everything all right, Eleanor?" he asked with genuine concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Eleanor sank into her chair behind the desk, her legs feeling too unsteady to support her weight. "I think I may have just made the biggest mistake of my professional life," she whispered, staring at her computer screen without really seeing it. "What happened up there?" James asked, leaning closer with the protective instinct that had made him such a comfort during her first uncertain days at Blackwood Industries. Eleanor looked up at him, her hazel eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. "I think," she said slowly, "that I may have accidentally drawn the attention of Adrian Blackwood himself, and I have absolutely no idea whether that's the best thing that could have happened to me or the worst." The hours between Mr. Chen's departure and Eleanor's appointed meeting with Adrian Blackwood stretched before her like a vast desert of anxiety and speculation. Each tick of the ornate clock that graced the lobby wall seemed to echo with ominous portent, marking time until what she had convinced herself would surely be her professional doom. She had attempted to lose herself in the familiar routines of her position, answering telephone calls, greeting visitors, managing the endless stream of deliveries that kept the corporate machinery functioning. But her mind refused to be quieted by such mundane distractions. James Morrison had made several attempts throughout the morning to draw her into conversation, his kind eyes reflecting the genuine concern that had made him such an unexpected source of comfort during her tenure at Blackwood Industries. But Eleanor found herself incapable of articulating the complex mixture of emotions that churned within her breast. How could she explain to this well-meaning man that she had spent her entire adult life cultivating the art of invisibility, only to find herself thrust into the spotlight of Adrian Blackwood's attention through what she could only characterize as a moment of compassionate impulse? The morning had yielded one small mercy in the form of a telephone call from Mr. Chen's assistant, conveying his profound gratitude for Eleanor's assistance and expressing his hope that their paths might cross again in the future. The young woman's voice had been warm with genuine appreciation as she relayed Mr. Chen's message that the meeting had proceeded exceptionally well, thanks in no small part to Eleanor's thoughtful intervention in facilitating the initial introduction. "Mr. Chen wanted me to tell you specifically," the assistant had said, her words carrying the weight of sincere emotion, "that your kindness and professionalism made him feel truly welcomed at Blackwood Industries. He said it's rare to encounter someone who goes so far beyond their basic job responsibilities to ensure another person's comfort and success. The compliment should have filled Eleanor with satisfaction and pride, but instead, it only intensified her anxiety about the approaching meeting. If Mr. Chen's business had concluded successfully, why would Adrian Blackwood feel the need to summon her to his office? The possibilities that presented themselves to her overactive imagination ranged from mild reprimand to complete termination, with very few scenarios offering any hope of positive outcome. At precisely 1:30, Eleanor's telephone rang with the distinctive tone that indicated an internal call. The voice that greeted her was crisp and professional, carrying the particular authority of someone accustomed to managing the complex schedules and demanding requirements of executive leadership. Miss Hartwell, this is Victoria Sterling, Mr. Blackwood's executive assistant. I'm calling to confirm your appointment with Mr. Blackwood at 2 o'clock this afternoon. He'll see you in his private office on the 43rd floor. When you arrive, please take the elevator to the executive level and follow the corridor to the end. My office is adjacent to his, and I'll escort you in when he's ready. Thank you, Miss Sterling, Eleanor managed, her voice steady despite the way her heart had begun to race anew. I'll be there promptly at 2 o'clock. Excellent, came the reply. Mr. Blackwood values punctuality above almost all other virtues, so I'm certain you'll make a favorable impression. The line went dead, leaving Eleanor to stare at the receiver in her hand while processing the subtle implications of Victoria Sterling's final comment. Was it possible that this meeting might not be the professional disaster she had been imagining? The executive assistant's tone had been neutral, neither warm nor cold, but there had been something in her phrasing that suggested Eleanor should prepare herself for something more significant than a simple reprimand. At 10 minutes before 2, Eleanor made her way to the ladies' restroom to compose herself for what lay ahead. The mirror reflected back a young woman whose typically pale complexion had taken on an almost ghostly pallor, whose usually neat auburn hair showed signs of the nervous fidgeting that had plagued her throughout the morning. She took several deep breaths, straightened her shoulders, and attempted to project the image of professional competence that she hoped might carry her through the ordeal to come. The elevator ride to the 43rd floor seemed both endless and far too brief, a paradox that left Eleanor feeling as though she was suspended in some sort of temporal limbo. When the brass doors finally opened to reveal the executive corridor, she found herself face to face with a level of luxury and refinement that made even yesterday's glimpse of the 42nd floor seem modest by comparison. The carpet beneath her feet was so thick and plush that her footsteps made no sound as she made her way toward the end of the corridor, where massive double doors of dark mahogany stood slightly ajar. The walls were lined with original artwork that Eleanor recognized from her art history courses, paintings and sculptures that belonged in museums rather than corporate offices, yet somehow seemed perfectly at home in this rarefied atmosphere. Victoria Sterling's office was a study in organized efficiency, with every surface clear of clutter and every document filed with military precision. The woman herself appeared to be in her early 40s, with platinum blonde hair arranged in a perfect chignon and a dove-grey suit that had clearly been tailored specifically for her tall, elegant frame. When she looked up from her computer screen, her blue eyes assessed Eleanor with the kind of thoroughness that suggested she made it her business to know everything about everyone who entered Adrian Blackwood's sphere of influence. "Miss Hartwell," she said, rising from her desk with fluid grace, "you're precisely on time. Mr. Blackwood will appreciate that." She gestured toward a pair of leather chairs arranged near a window that offered yet another breathtaking view of the city below. "He's just concluding a telephone call with our London office. Please make yourself comfortable." Eleanor perched on the edge of one of the chairs, her posture rigid with nervous tension. Victoria Sterling returned to her work, but Eleanor could feel the other woman's occasional glances, as though she were being subjected to some sort of subtle evaluation whose criteria remained entirely mysterious. The minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness, until finally the intercom on Victoria's desk crackled to life with Adrian Blackwood's distinctive voice. "Victoria, please send Miss Hartwell in." "Of course, Mr. Blackwood," Victoria replied, then turned to Eleanor with what might have been an encouraging smile. "He's ready for you now." Eleanor rose on unsteady legs and followed Victoria toward the imposing double doors. The executive assistant knocked softly before pushing them open to reveal an office that seemed designed to overwhelm and intimidate anyone who entered its domain. Adrian Blackwood's private office was a testament to wealth and power that took Eleanor's breath away. The space was enormous, easily twice the size of her entire apartment, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the city spread out below like a conquered kingdom. The furniture was all dark wood and rich leather, arranged with the kind of precision that suggested every element had been carefully chosen to project an image of absolute authority. Behind a desk that appeared to have been carved from a single massive piece of mahogany sat Adrian Blackwood himself, and Eleanor felt her carefully constructed composure falter as his steel-grey eyes fixed upon her with that same intense focus she remembered from their earlier encounter. He was even more imposing in this private setting, removed from the distractions of the conference room and able to direct his full attention toward whatever purpose had prompted him to summon her. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice carrying easily across the vast space, "please come in, have a seat." Eleanor moved forward on legs that felt decidedly unsteady, acutely aware of every step across the thick Persian carpet that covered the floor. She chose one of the leather chairs positioned in front of his desk, perching on its edge with the careful precision of someone prepared to flee at the first sign of danger. Adrian Blackwood leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression that revealed nothing of his thoughts or intentions. The silence stretched between them, growing more uncomfortable with each passing second, until Eleanor found herself fighting the urge to fill the void with nervous chatter. "Do you know why I've asked you here, Miss Hartwell?" he finally asked, his voice neutral but carrying an undertone of something she couldn't quite identify. Eleanor's throat felt suddenly dry as she attempted to formulate a response. I assume it has something to do with this morning's incident with Mr. Chen. If I overstepped my boundaries in some way, I want to apologize. I was only trying to help, and I hope I didn't compromise his meeting or create any problems for the company." Something that might have been amusement flickered across Adrian's features, though it was gone so quickly that Eleanor wondered if she had imagined it. "On the contrary, Miss Hartwell, Mr. Chen was effusive in his praise for your assistance. He specifically mentioned how welcomed and comfortable you made him feel, and how your intervention helped ensure that our meeting began on the most positive possible note." Eleanor blinked in confusion, her mind struggling to process this unexpected turn. I'm glad to hear that, Mr. Blackwood. Mr. Chen seemed like a genuinely kind person, and I wanted to make sure his visit went smoothly." "Indeed," Adrian replied, leaning forward slightly in his chair, "which brings me to the real reason I wanted to speak with you. Tell me, Miss Hartwell, how did you come to learn sign language?" The question caught Eleanor off guard, and she found herself fumbling for words as she tried to understand where this line of inquiry might be leading. "My mother was deaf," she said finally, her voice soft with the emotion that always accompanied thoughts of her late parent. "I learned to sign before I learned to speak. It was our language, the way we communicated when it was just the two of us." Adrian nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "And you maintained your fluency even after your mother's passing?" Eleanor felt a familiar pang of loss as she considered how to answer. I don't use it as much as I once did. After my mother died, I found myself moving primarily in the hearing world. But it's not something you forget, exactly. It's more like a musical instrument you haven't played in a while. The skills are still there, waiting to be recalled when the need arises. "How long have you been working at Blackwood Industries, Miss Hartwell?" The abrupt change of subject left Eleanor momentarily disoriented. 3 weeks, Mr. Blackwood. Today actually marks the beginning of my 4th week. And before joining our company, Eleanor hesitated, uncertain how much of her personal history would be appropriate to share in this context. I worked at a small accounting firm for 2 years after completing my business degree. Before that, I attended the Metropolitan Business College, where I studied office administration and business communications. Adrian leaned back in his chair again, his fingers steepled before him in a gesture that somehow managed to be both casual and deeply intimidating. What prompted you to leave your previous position? The question hit Eleanor like a physical blow, bringing back memories she had worked so hard to suppress. Her face flushed with embarrassment and something approaching shame as she struggled to find words that would explain her departure without revealing the full extent of her humiliation. "There were personal conflicts," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "The work environment became uncomfortable, and I felt it was best to seek opportunities elsewhere." Adrian's eyes sharpened with what Eleanor could only describe as predatory interest, and she had the unsettling sensation that he could see right through her carefully constructed evasion to the painful truth beneath. "I see," he said, his tone neutral but somehow conveying depths of understanding that made Eleanor shift uncomfortably in her chair. "And you've been satisfied with your position here at Blackwood Industries?" "Very much so," Eleanor replied, grateful for the change to more positive territory. "Everyone has been welcoming and professional, and I find the work challenging in all the best ways." "Challenging," Adrian repeated, as though testing the word. "That's interesting phrasing for what most people would consider a fairly routine receptionist position." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks at the implied criticism. "I didn't mean to suggest that the work itself was beneath me, Mr. Blackwood. I simply meant that I enjoy having responsibilities that require me to think and adapt, rather than simply following a script." "No offense taken, Miss Hartwell. In fact, your attitude toward your work is part of what prompted this conversation." Adrian stood suddenly, moving around his desk to lean against its front edge, bringing him much closer to Eleanor's chair. The change in position seemed calculated to create a more intimate atmosphere, though whether for better or worse she couldn't determine. "Miss Hartwell," he continued, his voice taking on a tone of serious consideration, "I have a proposition for you." Eleanor's heart began to race as her imagination immediately leaped to the worst possible interpretations of his statement. The memories of her previous employer's unwanted advances came flooding back, and she found herself gripping the arms of her chair as though preparing to flee. Adrian seemed to sense her distress because his next words came more quickly, as though he were attempting to forestall whatever conclusions her mind was drawing. "A professional proposition," he clarified, his tone gentle but firm. "I'd like to offer you a new position within the company, one that would make better use of your unique skills and abilities." Eleanor stared at him in stunned silence, her mind struggling to process this unexpected turn of events. "A new position," she managed finally. "Are you familiar with our international expansion initiatives, Miss Hartwell?" Eleanor shook her head, her voice deserting her entirely in the face of this surreal conversation. Blackwood Industries is in the process of establishing partnerships and subsidiaries in 17 countries across Asia, Europe, and South America. It's an enormously complex undertaking that requires us to navigate not only different business cultures and legal systems, but also significant communication barriers. Adrian paused, his steel-grey eyes fixed on Eleanor's face as though he were searching for something in her expression. This morning's interaction with Mr. Chen highlighted something that I had not previously considered: the extent to which communication accessibility could be a competitive advantage in our international dealings. Eleanor found her voice at last, though it emerged as little more than a whisper. "I'm not sure I understand what you're suggesting, Mr. Blackwood." "I'm suggesting," Adrian replied, his voice taking on the tone of someone accustomed to making decisions that would reshape entire industries. That Blackwood Industries needs someone to head up our new accessibility and international communications division. Someone who understands that effective communication goes far beyond simply speaking the same language. The words hit Eleanor like a thunderbolt, and she found herself staring at Adrian in complete bewilderment. Are you offering me a job? I'm offering you a career, Miss Hartwell. A chance to use your unique talents and experiences to help build something unprecedented in the corporate world. Adrian moved to stand behind his desk again, but his posture remained relaxed, almost conversational. The position would involve working directly with our international partners to ensure that communication barriers never prevent us from building meaningful business relationships. You would oversee the development of accessibility protocols for all our corporate facilities, and you would serve as our primary liaison with deaf and hard-of-hearing stakeholders in every market we enter. Eleanor felt as though the entire world had tilted on its axis. This morning, she had been a simple receptionist, grateful to have any employment at all. Now Adrian Blackwood, one of the most powerful men in the business world, was offering her a position that sounded like something from her most ambitious dreams. I don't know what to say, she stammered, her mind racing to catch up with the magnitude of what was being offered. Say you'll consider it, Adrian replied, his voice carrying a warmth that surprised her. The salary would be commensurate with the executive level of the position, significantly more than what you're currently earning, I assure you. You would have your own office, a dedicated staff, and a budget that would allow you to implement real change, not just within our company, but throughout the industry. Eleanor's practical nature began to assert itself over her shock and amazement. But Mr. Blackwood, I have no experience in executive management. I've never run a department or overseen a budget. How can you be certain that I'm qualified for something of this magnitude? Adrian smiled. The first genuinely warm smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his entire face in a way that made Eleanor's heart skip several beats. Miss Hartwell, this morning you took initiative to help someone in need without being asked. You demonstrated skills that most of our executives don't possess, and you did so with a grace and professionalism that left a lasting impression on a potential partner worth hundreds of millions of dollars to this company. He moved closer to her chair again, but this time his proximity felt less intimidating and more something else entirely, something that Eleanor didn't dare put a name to. More importantly, he continued, his voice dropping to a more intimate register, you showed compassion and human decency in a situation where many people would have simply directed Mr. Chen to someone else's desk. You saw a need and you filled it. Not because it was your job, but because it was the right thing to do. Eleanor felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, overwhelmed by the unexpected validation of qualities she had always considered unremarkable. I was just trying to help. Exactly, Adrian said softly, and that instinct, that genuine desire to help others succeed, is something that can't be taught. Everything else, management skills, budgeting, strategic planning, those are things you can learn. But the heart of what would make you exceptional in this role, that's already there. Eleanor looked up at him through her unshed tears, seeing not the intimidating corporate titan she had expected, but a man whose eyes held depths of understanding and something else, something that looked almost like admiration. What would you need from me? She asked, her voice still shaky with emotion. I would need you to trust yourself, Adrian replied. I would need you to believe that your experiences and your instincts have value, even in a world that might not always recognize it. And I would need you to be willing to take a risk on something entirely new. Eleanor sat in silence for several long moments, her mind churning with the implications of what he was offering. It was everything she had never dared to dream of. Respect, authority, the chance to make a real difference in the world. But it was also terrifying in its scope and responsibility. How long do I have to decide? She asked finally. Take all the time you need, Adrian replied, though something in his tone suggested that he hoped her decision would come sooner rather than later. This is a significant life change, and I want you to be absolutely certain it's what you want. Eleanor nodded, still struggling to process the enormity of what had just occurred. May I ask why you're offering this to me? Surely there are people with more experience, more qualifications. Adrian was quiet for so long that Eleanor wondered if she had somehow offended him with her question. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of something that might have been vulnerability. Because, Miss Hartwell, in all my years of building this company, I have rarely encountered someone who embodies the values I want Blackwood Industries to represent. You saw someone who needed help, and you helped them. You didn't calculate the benefit to yourself or worry about overstepping boundaries. You simply did what needed to be done with grace and competence. He moved to the window, gazing out at the city spread below, as though seeing it with new eyes. That kind of authentic humanity is rare in the corporate world, Miss Hartwell, and it's exactly what we need if we're going to build something truly extraordinary. Eleanor rose from her chair on unsteady legs, feeling as though she had just experienced something that would divide her life into distinct periods, before this conversation and everything that would come after. Thank you, Mr. Blackwood, she said, her voice stronger than she had expected it to be, for seeing something in me that I'm not sure I see in myself. Adrian turned back to her, and the smile that lit his face was like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The question, Miss Hartwell, is whether you're brave enough to see it too. As Eleanor made her way back to the elevator, her mind reeling with everything that had transpired, she found herself thinking about her mother, about the woman who had faced a world that often saw her deafness as a limitation, rather than simply a different way of experiencing life. Sarah Hartwell had taught her daughter that true strength came not from demanding attention, but from quietly doing what needed to be done, and trusting that the right people would eventually notice. Perhaps, Eleanor thought, as the elevator doors closed behind her, it was time to trust that her mother had been right. The days that followed Eleanor's extraordinary meeting with Adrian Blackwood passed in a haze of contemplation and inner turmoil that left her feeling as though she were suspended between two entirely different versions of her life. By day, she continued to perform her duties as receptionist with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized her tenure at Blackwood Industries. But beneath the surface of her professional composure, her mind churned with questions and possibilities that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. She had not yet provided Adrian with an answer to his unprecedented offer, though she was acutely aware of his presence whenever he passed through the lobby. Their eyes would meet for the briefest of moments, encounters that lasted no more than a few seconds, but somehow managed to convey volumes of unspoken communication. In his gaze, she detected patience tinged with anticipation, as though he understood the magnitude of the decision before her and was willing to allow her the time she needed to reach the right conclusion. Yet Eleanor found herself plagued by doubts that seemed to multiply like shadows at twilight. The rational part of her mind, the part that had been shaped by years of disappointment and the hard lessons of a world that rarely rewarded those who dared to dream beyond their circumstances, whispered incessant warnings about the dangers of reaching too high. What if she accepted this position only to discover that she was woefully inadequate for its demands? What if Adrian Blackwood's faith in her abilities proved to be misplaced, leaving her not only unemployed, but professionally ruined? The evenings were the worst, when she returned to her modest apartment and found herself alone with her thoughts and the echoing silence that had been her constant companion since her mother's death. She would sit by the window that overlooked the small courtyard behind her building, watching the play of light and shadow across the brick walls, while her mind replayed every moment of her conversation with Adrian Blackwood. It was during one such evening of reflection that Eleanor made a decision that surprised even her. She would seek counsel from the one person whose wisdom had never failed her, even in death. The next morning, for the first time in over 2 years, she made her way to Greenwood Cemetery, where her mother lay beneath a simple granite headstone that bore the words, Sarah Hartwell, beloved mother, teacher, friend. The autumn air was crisp with the promise of winter, and fallen leaves crunched beneath Eleanor's feet as she navigated the winding paths that led to her mother's grave. She had brought with her a small bouquet of white roses, her mother's favorite flowers, and as she knelt to place them beside the headstone, she felt the familiar mixture of grief and comfort that always accompanied these visits. "Hello, Mama," she said softly, her hands moving in the sign language that had been their private language throughout her childhood. "I'm sorry it's been so long since I've come to see you. I know you would understand. You always said that the living must focus on living, not on mourning the dead." The cemetery was peaceful in the way that only such places could be, removed from the constant noise and urgency of the modern world. Eleanor settled herself on the grass beside her mother's grave, drawing her coat more tightly around her shoulders as she prepared to share the burden that had been weighing so heavily on her heart. "Something extraordinary has happened, Mama," she continued, her fingers forming the familiar patterns that felt like a homecoming after so many months of existing purely in the hearing world. "I've been offered an opportunity that seems almost too good to be true. A man, a very important, powerful man, has seen something in me that he believes could make a difference in the world." She paused, watching a small sparrow hop among the fallen leaves as she gathered her thoughts. "But I'm frightened, Mama. I'm terrified that I'll accept this chance and discover that I'm not who he thinks I am. What if I fail? What if I disappoint everyone who believes in me?" The wind rustled through the bare branches of the oak tree that stood sentinel over this section of the cemetery, and Eleanor found herself remembering her mother's voice. Not the visual language of their hands, but the particular way Sarah Hartwell had of humming when she was deep in thought. A sound that had always meant safety and unconditional love to her young daughter. "You always told me," Eleanor signed to the headstone, "that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. You said that the only true failure was the failure to try, to let fear keep us from becoming who we were meant to be." As she sat in the peaceful silence of the cemetery, Eleanor began to understand that her mother's wisdom had been leading her toward this moment for her entire life. Every struggle they had faced together, every barrier they had overcome, every moment of connection they had shared across the bridge of sign language, it had all been preparation for the choice that now lay before her. "I think," she signed slowly, her hands moving with increasing confidence, "that you would want me to be brave. You would want me to trust in the lessons you taught me and the strength you helped me develop. You would want me to step forward into this new life, not because it's safe, but because it's right." Eleanor remained at the cemetery for another hour, signing to her mother about her fears and hopes, about Adrian Blackwood and the strange mixture of terror and excitement his offer had awakened in her. By the time she rose to leave, placing a gentle kiss on her fingertips before touching them to the headstone in farewell, she had reached a decision that filled her with both trepidation and a sense of rightness that seemed to emanate from the very depths of her soul. The next morning, Eleanor arrived at Blackwood Industries with a sense of purpose that manifested itself in every aspect of her bearing. Her step was more confident, her smile more genuine, and when she greeted the familiar stream of visitors and colleagues, there was something in her manner that suggested a fundamental shift had occurred. At precisely 10 o'clock, she placed a call to Victoria Sterling's extension, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her voice steady with resolve. "Miss Sterling, this is Eleanor Hartwell. I was wondering if Mr. Blackwood might have a few minutes available this morning to continue our conversation from earlier in the week." "Let me check his schedule," Victoria replied, and Eleanor could hear the soft clicking of computer keys in the background. "He has a brief window at 10:30. Would that work for you?" "That would be perfect," Eleanor replied. "Thank you so much." The 25 minutes that elapsed between her phone call and her appointment seemed to stretch like hours, But Eleanor used the time to mentally rehearse what she wanted to say, how she wanted to present herself, and the questions she needed to ask before making her final commitment. When she knocked on Adrian's office door at precisely 10:30, his familiar voice called for her to enter, and she found him standing at the magnificent windows that overlooked the city, his hands clasped behind his back, in a posture that spoke of deep contemplation. "Miss Hartwell," he said, turning to face her with an expression that seemed carefully neutral, though she detected something hopeful in the depths of his steel-grey eyes. "I'm glad you called. Please have a seat." Eleanor chose the same chair she had occupied during their previous meeting, but this time she settled into it with a composure that surprised even her. "Mr. Blackwood, I've given a great deal of thought to your offer, and I have some questions before I provide you with my answer." Adrian moved to take his seat behind the imposing desk, leaning forward with an expression of attentive interest. "Of course. Please, ask whatever you need to know." First," Eleanor began, her voice clear and steady, "I want to understand exactly what success would look like in this position. What specific goals would you expect me to achieve, and how would my performance be evaluated?" Adrian's eyebrows rose slightly, and Eleanor detected what might have been approval in his expression. "Excellent question. In the short term, the first 6 months, I would expect you to conduct a comprehensive assessment of our current international operations, identifying communication barriers and accessibility challenges that may be limiting our effectiveness. You would also begin developing relationships with advocacy organizations and accessibility consultants who could help us implement best practices." He paused, consulting a leather portfolio that lay open on his desk. "In the medium term, 6 months to 2 years, I would expect to see the implementation of concrete accessibility improvements across all our facilities and communications platforms. We should be recognized as an industry leader in inclusive business practices, and that recognition should begin translating into competitive advantages in our international markets." "And long-term?" Eleanor prompted. "Long-term, I envision Blackwood Industries becoming the standard by which other corporations measure their commitment to accessibility and inclusive communication. Your division should be generating measurable returns on investment through improved international partnerships, expanded market penetration, and enhanced corporate reputation." Eleanor nodded slowly, impressed by the specificity and ambition of his vision. "My second question concerns resources. What kind of budget and staff support would be available to achieve these goals?" Adrian smiled, a genuine expression of pleasure that transformed his entire face. "You're asking all the right questions, Miss Hartwell. The initial budget for your division would be $2 million annually, with the understanding that successful programs would merit expanded funding. You would have authority to hire up to 5 full-time staff members initially, with room for growth as the division's responsibilities expand." The numbers were staggering to Eleanor, who had never imagined having responsibility for such substantial resources. "And my third question," she continued, determined to maintain her professional composure despite her inner amazement, "concerns my own development. I would need significant training in management, budgeting, strategic planning, skills that are essential for success, but which I currently lack." "Naturally," Adrian replied. "The company would provide comprehensive executive training, including enrollment in relevant courses at the business school of your choice. You would also have access to mentorship programs and consulting services to help you develop the expertise you need." Eleanor sat quietly for several moments, processing everything he had shared and measuring it against her own doubts and aspirations. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a strength and conviction that surprised them both. "Mr. Blackwood, I accept your offer." The transformation in Adrian's expression was immediate and profound. The careful neutrality that had characterized his manner throughout their conversation gave way to something much warmer and more personal: relief, satisfaction, and something else that Eleanor couldn't quite identify, but which made her pulse quicken inexplicably. "I'm delighted to hear that, Miss Hartwell. he said, rising from his chair and extending his hand across the desk. "Welcome to the executive team at Blackwood Industries." Eleanor stood and accepted his handshake, marveling at the warmth and strength of his grip and the way his touch seemed to send small currents of electricity up her arm. "Thank you for believing in me, Mr. Blackwood. I promise I won't disappoint you." "I have no doubt about that," he replied, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer than strictly professional protocol would dictate. "And please, since we'll be working closely together, I hope you'll call me Adrian." "Indeed." The use of his first name felt both thrilling and terrifying, a breach of the careful barriers she had maintained between herself and those who wielded power over her professional life. "Adrian," she repeated softly, testing the name on her tongue and finding that it felt surprisingly natural. "Excellent," Adrian said, though he made no move to release her hand. "Now, there are several practical matters we need to discuss. Your salary will be commensurate with other executive positions, $150,000 annually to start, with performance bonuses based on the achievement of predetermined goals." Eleanor felt her knees go weak at the mention of a salary that was nearly 4 times what she had been earning as a receptionist. That's very generous," she managed. "It's what the position merits," Adrian replied matter-of-factly. "You'll also have full executive benefits, health insurance, retirement contributions, 4 weeks of paid vacation annually, and access to the executive dining facilities and fitness center." Each benefit he mentioned seemed to Eleanor like something from a dream, perks that belonged to a different world from the one she had always inhabited. "When would you like me to start in this new role?" "Immediately," Adrian replied, his tone suggesting that delay was not an option he wished to consider. "Your office is being prepared on the 41st floor. Nothing as elaborate as this, naturally, but comfortable and well-appointed. Victoria will help you coordinate the transition and ensure that you have everything you need." Eleanor nodded, her mind reeling with the rapid pace at which her life was changing. "And my replacement as receptionist?" "Already handled," Adrian said with the confidence of someone accustomed to anticipating and solving problems before they became complications. "We have an excellent temporary placement service that will provide coverage until we can conduct a proper search for a permanent replacement." As they discussed the logistics of her transition, Eleanor found herself studying Adrian's face with new eyes. The intimidating corporate titan she had feared was still there, but she was beginning to see other facets of his character. Intelligence tempered with compassion, authority balanced by genuine respect for others, and an underlying warmth that suggested depths she had never suspected. "There is one more thing," Adrian said as their meeting drew to a close. "Your first major project will be to organize a comprehensive accessibility assessment of our international operations. I'd like you to begin by traveling to our offices in London, Tokyo, and Sao Paulo to evaluate current conditions and develop recommendations for improvement." Eleanor's eyes widened at the prospect of international travel, something she had only dreamed of during her years of financial struggle. "That sounds incredible," she said softly. "The travel arrangements will be first class, naturally, and you'll have a generous expense account for meals and accommodations." Adrian continued, "I want you to see these operations from the perspective of someone who understands the challenges our international partners might face, and I want you to have the authority to begin implementing solutions immediately." As Eleanor prepared to leave his office, her mind buzzing with plans and possibilities, Adrian's voice stopped her at the door. "Eleanor," he said, and the use of her first name sent another small thrill through her already overwhelmed system. "I want you to know that I have complete confidence in your abilities. Don't let doubt or fear keep you from becoming everything I know you can be." Eleanor turned back to face him, seeing in his expression something that looked remarkably like pride. Not the condescending pride of a superior, pleased with a subordinate's performance, but the genuine pleasure of someone who had recognized potential and was delighted to see it beginning to unfold. "Thank you, Adrian," she replied, her voice carrying new strength and conviction. "I won't let you down." As she made her way back to the elevator, Eleanor caught sight of her reflection in the polished metal doors and was startled to see a woman she barely recognized. Shoulders straight, chin raised, eyes bright with purpose and determination. The transformation was so complete that she wondered if anyone would recognize the timid receptionist she had been just moments before. The remainder of the day passed in a whirlwind of activity as Victoria Sterling efficiently managed Eleanor's transition from her old role to her new position. There were forms to complete, passwords to establish, identification badges to update, and a dozen other administrative details that marked her passage from one world to another. By 5 o'clock, Eleanor found herself standing in what was now her office, a beautifully appointed space with a view of the city that took her breath away. The desk was mahogany like Adrian's, but smaller and more elegant. The chairs were upholstered in soft leather, and bookshelves lined one wall, waiting to be filled with the resources she would need for her new responsibilities. As she stood at the window, watching the sun begin to set over the skyline, Eleanor reflected on the extraordinary series of events that had brought her to this moment. Less than a week ago, she had been struggling with anxiety and self-doubt, convinced that she was destined to remain invisible in the shadows of other people's ambitions. Now she found herself an executive at one of the most prestigious corporations in the world, entrusted with responsibilities that could shape the future of international business practices. But perhaps most remarkable of all was the growing awareness that her transformation had begun not with Adrian Blackwood's offer, but with her simple decision to help a stranger who needed assistance. In that moment of compassionate action, she had unknowingly set in motion a chain of events that would reshape not only her own life, but potentially the lives of countless others who faced similar barriers to communication and inclusion. As Eleanor gathered her belongings and prepared to leave her new office, she found herself thinking once again of her mother and the lessons that had shaped her understanding of what it meant to live with courage and purpose. Sarah Hartwell had taught her daughter that true strength came not from demanding recognition, but from quietly doing what needed to be done and trusting that the right people would eventually notice. Perhaps, Eleanor thought as she made her way toward the elevator, her mother had been preparing her for this moment all along, not just to accept opportunities when they came, but to create them through acts of genuine humanity and compassion. The shy receptionist who had helped a deaf visitor with sign language was gone, replaced by someone Eleanor was only beginning to discover, a woman capable of leadership, vision, and the kind of impact that could ripple outward to touch lives she had never even imagined. 6 months had passed since Eleanor Hartwell had ascended from the reception desk to the executive floors of Blackwood Industries, and the transformation in both her circumstances and her character had been nothing short of remarkable. The timid young woman who had once trembled at the prospect of drawing attention to herself had evolved into a confident leader whose reputation for innovation and compassion had begun to extend far beyond the walls of the corporate headquarters. Her office on the 41st floor had become a testament to her growing influence and expertise. The bookshelves that had once stood empty were now filled with volumes on international business law, accessibility standards, cultural communication patterns, and organizational psychology. The walls displayed certificates from the executive training programs she had completed with distinction, as well as photographs from her travels to Blackwood Industries' international offices, where she had implemented groundbreaking accessibility improvements that had already begun to yield measurable results. But perhaps the most significant change was visible in Eleanor herself. The severe chignons and muted colors that had once characterized her appearance had given way to softer hairstyles and clothing that reflected both professional authority and personal confidence. Her hazel eyes, once quick to avoid contact with others, now met gazes directly with warmth and assurance. When she walked through the corridors of Blackwood Industries, executives and staff members alike turned to greet her with genuine respect and affection. The success of her international accessibility initiative had exceeded even Adrian's ambitious expectations. The London office had become a model of inclusive design, with visual alert systems, multilingual signage, and communication protocols that had not only improved accessibility for disabled employees and visitors, but had also enhanced overall efficiency and customer satisfaction. The improvements in Tokyo had resulted in a significant increase in partnerships with Japanese firms, whose executives had previously struggled with language and cultural barriers. Most remarkably, the São Paulo office had become a regional hub for companies seeking to improve their own accessibility standards, generating an entirely new revenue stream that more than justified the investment in Eleanor's division. But for all her professional achievements, Eleanor found herself increasingly aware of a different kind of transformation taking place. One that had less to do with her career advancement and more to do with her growing relationship with the man who had made it all possible. Adrian Blackwood had proven to be more than just a visionary executive. He had become her mentor, her advocate, and increasingly, something she dared not yet name even to herself. Their weekly progress meetings had evolved from formal business discussions into wide-ranging conversations about philosophy, social responsibility, and the future of corporate leadership. Eleanor had discovered that beneath Adrian's intimidating professional exterior lay a man of remarkable depth and complexity, someone whose commitment to making a positive impact on the world matched and even exceeded her own. It had begun with small gestures, a coffee delivered to her office during particularly long days, thoughtful questions about her personal well-being, in addition to her professional progress, invitations to join him for working dinners that inevitably extended into discussions of art, literature, and their shared vision for creating a more inclusive business environment. Eleanor had found herself looking forward to these interactions with an anticipation that had nothing to do with career advancement and everything to do with the simple pleasure of his company. The realization that her feelings for Adrian had evolved beyond professional gratitude and respect had come gradually, like dawn breaking over a landscape she had never expected to inhabit. She had caught herself studying his profile during board meetings, memorizing the way his eyes lit up when he spoke about projects he was passionate about, finding excuses to visit his office for consultations that could easily have been handled via email or telephone. But Eleanor's natural caution and ingrained sense of propriety had prevented her from acknowledging these feelings, even to herself. Adrian Blackwood was not merely her superior. He was one of the most powerful and eligible men in the business world, someone whose romantic interests, when they were discussed at all in the business press, seemed to center on sophisticated socialites and accomplished professionals who moved in circles far removed from Eleanor's own modest background. It was on a Friday evening in late spring, as Eleanor was preparing to leave her office after completing the final report on her international accessibility initiative, that her carefully maintained equilibrium was finally disturbed by an unexpected encounter that would force her to confront the true nature of her feelings. She had been gathering her belongings when a soft knock at her door interrupted her preparations for departure. Looking up, she found Adrian standing in her doorway, but this was not the impeccably groomed executive she was accustomed to seeing. His tie was loosened, his usually perfect hair showed signs of having been run through with fingers, and there was something in his expression, a mixture of exhaustion and vulnerability that she had never witnessed before. "Adrian," she said, rising from her chair with immediate concern. "Is everything all right?" He stepped into her office, closing the door behind him with a gesture that seemed both significant and somehow final. "I've just come from a board meeting that lasted 6 hours, he said, his voice carrying a weariness that went beyond mere physical fatigue. "We were discussing the quarterly reports, and your division's performance came up." Eleanor felt her heart skip, uncertain whether this development boded well or ill for her future. "Oh?" Adrian moved to the window that overlooked the city, his hands clasped behind his back, in the familiar gesture she had come to associate with his moments of deep contemplation. The board members were unanimous in their praise for what you've accomplished, Eleanor. The accessibility improvements have not only met every goal we established, but they've opened up entirely new markets and revenue streams that no one had anticipated. Relief flooded through Eleanor's system, followed immediately by pride in what her team had achieved. That's wonderful news. I'm so pleased that the board recognizes the value of inclusive business practices. But that's not why I'm here, Adrian continued, turning away from the window to face her directly. In the golden light of the setting sun that streamed through the glass, his features seemed softer somehow, less intimidating and more purely human than she had ever seen them. "Then why are you here?" Eleanor asked softly, though something in his manner suggested that this conversation would venture into territory they had never explored before. Adrian was quiet for so long that Eleanor wondered if he had changed his mind about whatever he had come to say. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and careful, as though he were navigating through treacherous emotional waters. "Do you remember the first day we met, Eleanor, when you were interpreting for Mr. Chen?" "Of course," she replied, uncertain where this line of conversation might lead. "I've been thinking about that day quite a lot recently," Adrian said, moving closer to where she stood. "About the way you stepped forward to help someone without hesitation, without calculating what might be in it for you. About the grace and competence you displayed in a situation that could have been awkward or embarrassing." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm under his intense scrutiny, but she met his gaze steadily. "I was just doing what needed to be done." "No," Adrian said, his voice taking on a tone of gentle correction. "You were being who you are, someone who sees need and responds to it with compassion and capability, someone who makes everyone around her better simply by being present." The compliment was so unexpected and so deeply felt that Eleanor found herself struggling for words. "Adrian, let me finish," he said, holding up a hand to forestall her response. "Over these past months, watching you transform from a shy receptionist into one of the most innovative executives in the industry, I've come to realize something that I've been trying to deny to myself for far too long." Eleanor's heart began to race as she sensed that they were approaching some sort of precipice, a moment that would forever change the nature of their relationship. "What have you realized?" Adrian stepped closer still, close enough that she could see the flecks of silver in his grey eyes, close enough that she could detect the subtle scent of his cologne and the warmth radiating from his body. "I've realized that somewhere along the way, my professional admiration for your abilities has become something much deeper and more personal." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge or a gift, depending upon how Eleanor chose to receive them. She felt her breath catch in her throat as she processed the implications of his admission. "What are you saying?" she whispered, though she suspected she already knew. "I'm saying," Adrian replied, his voice dropping to an intimate register that sent shivers down her spine, "that I've fallen in love with you, Eleanor Hartwell. I'm saying that every success you've achieved has filled me not just with professional pride, but with personal joy. I'm saying that I find myself looking for excuses to spend time with you, thinking about you at inappropriate moments during board meetings, and imagining a future that includes you not just as a colleague, but as something much more significant." Eleanor stared at him in stunned silence, her mind struggling to process the magnitude of what he had just revealed. The shy receptionist, who still lived somewhere deep inside her, whispered that this was impossible, that men like Adrian Blackwood didn't fall in love with women like her. But the confident executive she had become recognized the sincerity in his voice, the vulnerability in his expression, and the way his entire being seemed focused on her response. "Adrian," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I don't know what to say. This is so unexpected." "Is it really?" he asked gently. "Haven't you felt the connection between us growing stronger with each passing day? Haven't you noticed the way our professional conversations drift into personal territory? The way we linger after meetings have officially concluded? The way we seem to understand each other on levels that go far beyond workplace collaboration. Eleanor found herself nodding slowly, acknowledging truths she had been afraid to examine too closely. Yes, she admitted softly, I have noticed those things. But I assumed it was just my imagination or wishful thinking on my part. Wishful thinking, Adrian repeated, his eyebrows rising with what might have been hope. Does that mean you've been wishing for something more between us? The direct question forced Eleanor to confront feelings she had been carefully suppressing for months. Looking into Adrian's eyes, she saw not the intimidating corporate titan who had the power to reshape her life with a single decision, but simply a man who was offering her his heart with no guarantee that she would treat it gently. Yes, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. I have been wishing for something more. I've been falling in love with you too, Adrian, though I've been too frightened to admit it even to myself. The smile that broke across Adrian's face was radiant with joy and relief. Frightened of what? Frightened that I was misreading the situation, Eleanor replied honestly. Frightened that you would think I was presumptuous or inappropriate. Frightened that I would lose not just my job, but also the most meaningful friendship I've ever had with someone who isn't family. Adrian reached out slowly, giving her time to retreat if she chose, and gently cupped her face in his hands. Eleanor, he said, his voice tender with emotion, you could never lose my friendship or my respect. Regardless of how you respond to what I've told you today, you will always have both of those things. But Eleanor had no intention of retreating. Instead, she stepped closer to him, closing the distance between them until they were standing so close that she could feel the warmth of his breath against her cheek. What exactly are you asking of me, Adrian? She whispered. I'm asking, he replied, his thumbs gently caressing her cheekbones, if you would consider allowing our relationship to become something more than professional. I'm asking if you would be willing to explore what might develop between us if we gave ourselves permission to stop fighting these feelings. Eleanor's answer came not in words, but in actions, as she rose on her toes to close the final distance between them, pressing her lips to his, in a kiss that seemed to contain all the months of suppressed longing and growing connection that had brought them to this moment. Adrian's response was immediate and tender, his arms encircling her waist as he deepened the kiss, pouring into it all the emotion and desire he had been carefully controlling. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Eleanor saw in his eyes a combination of passion and tenderness that took her breath away. Is that a yes? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. That's a yes to everything, Eleanor replied, her own voice thick with tears of joy she hadn't realized she was shedding. Yes, to exploring this relationship. Yes, to seeing where these feelings might lead us. Yes, to taking whatever risks are necessary to find out what we might build together. Adrian's kiss in response was deeper and more passionate than the first, and Eleanor found herself melting into his embrace with a sense of rightness and completion she had never experienced before. When they finally separated, both were smiling with the particular radiance that comes from having found something precious and unexpected. There's something else, Adrian said, his expression growing more serious. Something I need to tell you before we go any further with this. Eleanor felt a flutter of anxiety. What is it? The night I offered you this position, Adrian began, it wasn't just because of your interaction with Mr. Chen, though that was certainly the catalyst. The truth is, I had been watching you for days before that incident, noticing the way you treated every person who approached your desk with kindness and respect, the way you went above and beyond your basic responsibilities to ensure that everyone felt welcomed and valued. Eleanor stared at him in surprise. You had been watching me, not in any inappropriate way, Adrian clarified quickly. But I had noticed you, Eleanor. I had noticed your grace under pressure, your natural empathy, your quiet competence. When I saw you interpreting for Mr. Chen with such fluency and compassion, it simply confirmed what I had already begun to suspect, that you were someone special, someone who deserved opportunities that matched your abilities and character. Eleanor felt overwhelmed by this revelation. So the job offer was based entirely on merit and potential, Adrian assured her. My growing personal feelings for you had nothing to do with the professional opportunity I offered. If anything, those feelings developed because I was able to observe your character and abilities more closely. Eleanor nodded, understanding the importance of this distinction and feeling grateful that their professional relationship had maintained its integrity even as their personal connection had deepened. What happens now? She asked. How do we navigate this new dimension of our relationship while maintaining our professional responsibilities? Adrian smiled, his expression reflecting both tenderness and the practical wisdom that had made him such a successful executive. Very carefully, he said. We'll need to establish clear boundaries between our personal and professional interactions. We'll need to be transparent with HR about our relationship to ensure that there are no conflicts of interest. And we'll need to be prepared for the fact that some people may question whether your achievements are based on merit or favoritism. Eleanor felt a flicker of the old anxiety at the thought of such scrutiny, but it was quickly overwhelmed by her confidence in her own abilities and accomplishments. I'm not afraid of that scrutiny, she said firmly. My work speaks for itself, and I know that everything I've achieved has been earned through effort and competence. That's exactly the response I hoped to hear, Adrian replied, his pride in her evident in his expression. Because the woman I've fallen in love with is someone who faces challenges with courage and integrity, someone who refuses to be diminished by other people's small-mindedness or prejudice. As they stood together in Eleanor's office, watching the last rays of sunlight fade from the sky outside her window, both understood that they were at the beginning of something that would require courage, wisdom, and mutual respect to navigate successfully. But they also understood that what they had found together, this combination of professional compatibility, intellectual connection, and deepening emotional intimacy, was rare and precious enough to justify whatever challenges lay ahead. There's one more thing, Adrian said, his voice taking on a playful note that Eleanor had rarely heard from him before. I have a confession to make about that first day when you were helping Mr. Chen. What kind of confession? Eleanor asked, intrigued by the mischievous glint in his eyes. I may have lingered in that corridor outside the conference room longer than was strictly necessary, Adrian admitted, his cheeks coloring slightly. I wanted to watch you interact with him, to see how you handled the situation. I was fascinated by you. Eleanor laughed, a sound of pure joy that seemed to light up the entire office. So you were spying on me? Observing, Adrian corrected with mock dignity. I was observing a remarkable woman doing remarkable work, and I was already beginning to fall under your spell. Eleanor reached up to touch his face gently, marveling at the way this powerful, sophisticated man seemed to transform in her presence into someone softer and more vulnerable. I love you, Adrian Blackwood, she said, the words feeling natural and right on her lips. I love your vision, your integrity, your kindness, and the way you see potential in people even when they can't see it in themselves. And I love you, Eleanor Hartwell, Adrian replied, covering her hand with his own. I love your compassion, your strength, your intelligence, and the way you make everyone around you feel valued and understood. And as they kissed again in the gathering darkness of her office, Eleanor reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from the reception desk to this moment of profound personal and professional fulfillment. The shy young woman, who had trembled at the thought of drawing attention to herself, had been replaced by someone confident enough to embrace love and opportunity with equal courage. But perhaps most remarkably, Eleanor understood that her transformation had begun not with Adrian's job offer, or even with his declaration of love, but with her simple decision to help a stranger who needed assistance. In that moment of compassionate action, she had unknowingly set in motion a chain of events that would reshape not only her own life, but also the lives of countless others who would benefit from the inclusive business practices she had pioneered. As they left the office together that evening, walking side by side through the lobby where Eleanor had once sat behind the reception desk, she caught sight of their reflection in the polished marble walls and saw not a powerful executive and his subordinate, but two equals who had found in each other the perfect complement to their individual strengths and aspirations. The future stretched before them, filled with both challenges and possibilities, the ongoing work of building a more inclusive corporate culture, the delicate navigation of their dual personal and professional relationship, and the simple joy of discovering what two people who genuinely love and respect each other can accomplish when they combine their efforts and dreams. But Eleanor faced that future without fear, secure in the knowledge that she had finally become the woman her mother had always believed she could be. Someone brave enough to help others, wise enough to recognize opportunity when it presented itself, and strong enough to embrace love when it came to her in the most unexpected form. The shy receptionist who had helped a deaf guest with sign language was gone, replaced by a woman who understood that true strength came not from remaining invisible, but from having the courage to step forward into the light and become everything she was meant to be.